The French President Emmanuel Macron has called for a common EU debt capacity to fund green tech and defense, arguing Europe must invest in its future.
The European Parliament approved a legislative tweak that will enable EU states to send asylum seekers to countries they have no link with.
At least 8 people were killed in a school shooting in Canada's westernmost province of British Columbia early on Wednesday. Police say more than 24 others were injured to various degrees. 2 people were airlifted to hospital from Tumbler Ridge High School to receive urgent care after sustaining life-threatening injuries. Meanwhile, 2 other people were also found dead in a nearby home to the school, which authorities believe may be connected to the attack. Police say the shooter has been identified as a female suspect, but did not release their name, pending further probes. Investigations are still ongoing as police look to identify the motives behind the shooting and whether any of the victims are connected to the suspect in any way. Authorities say the shooter was also found dead on site from what appears to be of a self-inflicted injury.
The French president has called for a common EU debt capacity and Eurobonds to fund green tech, defense and security, arguing Europe must invest in its future. Emmanuel Macron warned that Europe risks being swept aside by the US and China without a common EU debt capacity. The EU is under-indebted compared with the United States and China in a moment of a technological investment race. Failing to use this borrowing capacity is a profound mistake, Macron said. The French leader renewed his call for common debt through Eurobonds, arguing the EU needs around 1.2 trillion euros per year in public and private investment for green and digital technologies and defense. The EU used joint debt in 2020 to reboot the European economy after the COVID-19 pandemic, but French attempts to make such tools permanent have faced stiff pushback from Germany and the generally frugal northern member states. EU leaders will hold an informal retreat in Belgium on Thursday to discuss strengthening the single market, reducing economic dependencies and boosting competitiveness.
During a first-ever visit by a U.S. Vice President to Armenia, J.D. Vance announced multiple new agreements between the two countries after meeting with Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan in Yerevan. The two signed a civil nuclear energy agreement and a U.S. drone technology sale to Armenia worth €9.2 million. Vance is visiting both Armenia and Azerbaijan this week to promote a new trade corridor that would reshape the South Caucasus. The so-called Trump Route for International Peace and Prosperity is aimed at connecting Central Asia and the Caspian Basin to Europe while bypassing Russia and Iran.
President Trump knows very well the very best way to ensure that you have peace is to establish real deterrence. And the best way to establish real deterrence is with the best military technology in the world, and the United States has that.
Փոխնախագահ Վենսի հետ այսօր ստորագրեցինք քիչ առաջ Հայաստանի Հանրապետության եւ Ամերիկայի Միացյալ Նահանգների կառավարությունների միջև խաղաղ նպատակներով միջուկային էներգիայի ոլորտում համագործակցության մասին 1-2-3 կոչվող համաձայնագրի բանակցությունների ավարտի մասին համատեղ հայտարարությունը։ Այս համաձայնագիրը նորեջ կբացի Հայաստանի եւ ԱՄՆ-ի միջև խորացող էներգետիկ գործընկերության ասպարեզում կնպաստի Հայաստանի էներգետիկ ռեսուրսների բազմազանեցմանը
Commenting on the new agreements, Vance said that the very best way to ensure that you have peace is to establish real deterrence. In August 2025, US President Donald Trump brokered an agreement between Armenia and Azerbaijan that saw the two countries commit to renouncing claims on each other's territory and refraining from using force.
EU states will be able to send asylum seekers to countries they have no link with, as the UK has tried to do with Rwanda in the past. The legislative tweak was approved Tuesday at the European Parliament with 396 votes in favour, 226 votes against and 30 abstentions. The change in the safe third country concept paves the way to agreements between EU states and foreign governments, which would receive money for accepting migrants from Europe.
So what we're doing with the two files is giving member states the flexibility they urgently need at hand to assess asylum claims in a fast, in an efficient, and in a way that helps alleviating the pressure from national capacities.
Asylum seekers can be transferred to virtually any country in the world, provided it is considered safe. Safeguards include protection from persecution and the respect of non-refoulement. Social Democrats, Liberals and Greens opposed the legislative change.
Non siete riusciti ad alzare muri, ma avete fatto di peggio. State usando le leggi come un muro. Oggi votate per distruggere il diritto di asilo in Europa.
The provision will not be applied to unaccompanied minors whose asylum applications will still have to be assessed in European countries. Although the EU ranks as the least corrupt region, progress against corruption has stalled over the past decade. The average score in the EU is 62 out of 100, compared to 42 out of 100 globally, according to Transparency International's 2025 Corruption Perceptions Index. Hungary, Bulgaria and Romania are the EU countries where perceived levels of public sector corruption is the highest, according to the NGO. On the opposite end of the spectrum, Denmark, Finland and Sweden are the EU countries perceived as the least corrupt. The NGO observed backsliding trends in a few EU countries such as Hungary, Bulgaria and Slovakia.
In the last year in Slovakia, there's been campaigns within the government against the independent whistleblowing agency, impacts on the ability to investigate and prosecute against corruption being rolled back within the country.
The score of traditionally well-performing democracies like France, Sweden and the Netherlands dropped because of sanctions enforcement challenges and integrity scandals, but not only.
Another trend is that these countries are just simply had their eye off the ball when it comes to modernising their anti-corruption framework. I think the Netherlands and Sweden could particularly be put in that category where they just have not had strong standards when it's come to lobbying transparency or political finance transparency in regards to us knowing who is funding political parties within the country.
On the opposite, the Baltic score has increased as they implemented an effective anti-corruption strategy and improved political finance transparency, the experts said. In 2025, the EU adopted its first anti-corruption directive to harmonize EU law on combating corruption.
Revenues from Russian oil and gas, which have sustained the Kremlin's finances throughout its war on Ukraine, have dwindled to lows not seen in years. The drop in income is the result of punitive measures introduced by U.S. President Donald Trump, who imposed tariffs on countries who purchase Russian energy, like India. Also playing a role is the European Union's own tightening crackdown on sanction-dodging tankers carrying Russian oil and gas, known as the Shadow Fleet. The decrease in revenue is pushing President Vladimir Putin to raise taxes and borrow from Russian banks to keep state finances on an even keel, for now. In January, Moscow's energy revenues fell to 4.3 billion euros, an almost 33% decrease from the 6.4 billion recorded in December, and a staggering 65% decrease from January 2025's 12.2 billion. Washington's pressure made a serious dent in the Kremlin's finances, as sanctions imposed on Russia's two largest oil companies carried serious consequences for potential buyers. The White House said it would remove anyone buying Russian energy from its banking system, a serious concern for any multinational enterprise. Additionally, the EU's banning of fuel made from Russian crude meant that Moscow's export could no longer be refined elsewhere to make gasoline or diesel. Brussels is now proposing further sanctions, as the European Commission, at Finland and Sweden's suggestion, is exploring a full ban on shipping services for Russian energy. Commission President Ursula von der Leyen says hitting Russia's finances is the only way to get them to negotiate an end to their war with genuine intent.
Cuba is facing growing difficulties as a result of the United States oil embargo. Aviation authorities have banned aircraft operating in the region from landing on the isle to refuel. Long-haul flights crucial to Cuban tourism are being disrupted by fuel shortages, and Air Canada will suspend its services to the island from Monday. Cubans are allowed to purchase a maximum of 20 liters of fuel at a time and only in US dollars. At the same time, public transportation has been severely disrupted, with many bus routes no longer operating. Locals are trying to adapt to the extraordinary situation.
Visitar sí que son de batería porque aquí no hay más nada. Es con lo que resolvemos aquí. Y así, poquito a poco, echando para adelante para no ir de otra.
Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum pledged on Monday that her country would send aid to Cuba and would use all available diplomatic means to restart oil shipments to the island nation.
Puede uno estar de acuerdo o no con el régimen de gobierno de Cuba, pero no debe afectarse a los pueblos nunca.
As a result of the fuel shortage, banks in Cuba are operating with shorter opening hours. Several cultural events have been cancelled, and even the baseball season has been shortened.